In the last video, I detailed some of the main changes F1 has implemented for 2026, but there are more things worth explaining in more detail. So if you've watched that video and got a decent idea of the main headlines, let's continue to understand more about how we're going to go racing and some of the terminology you'll hear a lot of. Firstly, I did make a graphical error in my last video. I mislabeled my graphic of a turbo as an mgu-k in my files, and so I used a picture of a turbo every time I meant to use an mgu-k, and I didn't notice it while I was putting everything together, and this confused anyone who knows what a turbo looks like, so sorry about that. This is a turbo, this is an mgu-k, in basic looks. There's also another thing I didn't make entirely clear in order to keep things simple, so let's start with that. Battery storage. Now I told you under normal circumstances the car is allowed to regenerate 8.5 megajoules of energy per lap, and that is true. But the nuance is that the battery itself is only allowed to store 4 megajoules of energy maximally. So if each of these little squares represents half a megajoule of energy, then this pile is the total amount of electrical energy a car is allowed to generate over a lap. Now the battery can only hold 4 megajoules at a time, but of course it will be spending that energy over the lap too on acceleration. So let's say we start the lap with full battery, 4 megajoules. We spend some speeding down the main straight towards the first corner. Then we regenerate a bit in the braking phase, refilling the battery. Then we use some of that energy on the next straight until we get to a big braking zone where we recharge again, and so on through the lap. So you see, we only ever fill the battery to 4 megajoules and no more, but because we're using the energy as well as regenerating, we can get through all of the allowed 8.5 megajoules of regen through the whole lap. Now I say 8.5 megajoules is the energy regeneration limit normally, and that's partly because in overtake mode they are allowed an extra half a megajoule of energy, or one extra little cube, but also because 8.5 megajoules is not the limit at every track. At tracks where it's actually really hard to regenerate more than 8 megajoules, the FIA will limit this maximum down to 8 megajoules. This happened in Melbourne, a track that's actually one of the hardest of the year to regenerate energy due to its lack of significant braking zones across the lap. The FIA actually releases a document at the start of the race weekend detailing the power and energy limits in each session and power mode, including a graph, just like the one I showed you in my last video, which is neat. Same brain. Now energy regeneration doesn't only take place in braking zones. You kind of think of hybrid power units stealing the kinetic energy of the car via braking to recharge the battery, but it can also recharge the battery while the driver still has their foot to the floor, and this is currently called superclipping. Now this did exist in the previous era a bit, normally called something like derating, but essentially the power unit can be programmed into a mode whereby it starts stealing the power from the engine away from accelerating the car and into charging the battery. We saw this most acutely heading towards turn 9 in Melbourne. This was previously a tricky chicane off a flat-out section where drivers could brake late at over 300 km an hour and flick into that corner. This year, it was calculated to be more efficient to start diverting power from the engine into the mgu-k to recharge the battery as it approached turn 9. We saw cars drop about 50 km an hour on approach instead of carrying full speed into the braking zone. A lot of people didn't like this, and I agree it took a lot of the oomph out of qualifying in particular. But balancing where you push and recharge is the theme of this year, and it did produce some of the cat and mouse racing we saw on track. Superclipping is currently only allowed to harvest energy at 250 kilowatts, but the FIA are considering increasing it to 350 kilowatts, which would noticeably reduce the length over which it occurs. They also have the power to adjust these variables from track to track in ways they think suits, should the teams agree. If we go back for a sec to the FIA power unit information sheet for Australia, we can see there are different recharge limits for different sessions. Qualifying is as low as 7 megajoules per lap, purely to try and stop them superclipping so much, as that would be the only way they could possibly get anywhere near 8 megajoules. And even at 7 megajoules, the superclipping was too extreme for some. If we compare the same FIA information for China, you can see they're allowed to harvest a full 9 megajoules per lap in qualifying, because it's so much easier to regenerate energy there. It's worth looking at these numbers to get an idea of how each track might exhibit energy flow. Now let's talk briefly about turbo lag and the ongoing concerns with race starts. So in very basic terms, here's how a turbo works. When the engine is revving, the exhaust gases can get fed into the turbocharger, which spins it up really fast, allowing it to pump air into the combustion engine and increase its power. The problem they can have is it takes time between the gases being exhausted, the turbo being spun up sufficiently, and engine feeling the increased power effects. And this delay is called turbo lag. In the previous F1 era, the power units had an mgu-h. And very simply put, the mgu-h stored energy from the exhaust gases and used this energy to spin up the turbo. The difference is that the turbo isn't spun up live from the engine power. It can be spun up on demand by the mgu-h, so there's no lag, and it's spinning and adding power to the engine as soon as the driver demands it. Now, the mgu-h was taken away this year for not unreasonable reasons. A, it was very expensive technology. B, it added not insignificant weight to the car at a time when they're trying to get them lighter. C, it wasn't very road relevant, which some manufacturers take pretty seriously. D, it was such a sophisticated and unique technology to F1 that any newly joining power unit suppliers, like Audi or anyone else, were completely put off, as they would be miles behind everyone else in developing such a kit. So it was scrapped. And the consequences are they are susceptible to turbo lag under acceleration, meaning we're seeing drivers drop down to very low gears in the corners to get extra high revs to keep the turbo spinning and ready for action. But also, the start of the race is now a bit more chaotic. See, at the start of the race, F1 cars aren't allowed to use electrical power at all until they reach 50 km an hour. Now, granted, they do reach that incredibly quickly, but it means they have to pull away from the line on engine grunt alone. This means the turbos aren't ready to supply full power to the engines, and the mgu-k isn't available to spin up the turbos, which means the driver now has to rev their engines for a significant amount of time, waiting for the lights to go out to prepare the turbos. This is why there's now a pre-start sequence before the 5 red lights, to allow for exactly this. It's also why Ferrari are faster off the line than the other cars. They've built a smaller turbo that takes less time to spin up. Now, sure, it's a little bit less powerful, but they've focused on getting it to deliver more quickly, and it seems to be paying off in acceleration. Now let's switch over to active aerodynamics again and talk about a couple of the nuances in those rules. Now, as discussed, the wings can be switched between 2 modes, corner mode and straight mode, which was called straight line mode but seems to have become straight mode again in the rules. On fast, non-cornery sections of track, drivers can activate straight mode, drop both the rear and front wings to reduce drag and therefore reduce drain on the battery. However, there is a low grip provision the race director can invoke. Obviously, if it's super rainy or there's other low grip conditions, you might expect straight line mode to be disabled, like DRS was for maximum grip and safety. And that's a reasonable assumption. However, there is a problem with this, and that's the ride height. See, the cars are not allowed to run too low to the ground. They run very low to the ground, but they're kept from running too low by a plank on the underside of the car. If too much of this plank is worn away in a session, the car is disqualified. Now, the teams want the car to run as low as legally possible, and this is very carefully calibrated. If you expect a car to be in straight line mode on the straights, and suddenly, due to weather, you're asked to be in corner mode, the extra downforce from the wings will push the car down, probably too far down, and risk scraping the plank against the track and getting disqualified. This also increases the risk of aquaplaning in standing water if you're pushing the car super low. When the race director calls for low grip activation zones, the active aerodynamics only partially activate, likely putting the front wing in straight line mode and the rear wing in corner mode. This will stop the nose from diving down and help keep the floor from scraping on the ground. Furthermore, regarding wet weather, if there's a 40% chance of wet weather in a session, the FIA will allow the teams to adjust the cars to put them into a wet weather setup, in a limited way, changing the front wing angles to produce less downforce, ironically, and raising the ride height of the car to keep it from risk. They do need to signal this no later than 2 hours before the start of a session though. And that's some more detail on the rules this year. There seems to be a chance brewing that some further changes will be made to the rules soon, and if they do, I'll try and cover what's happening and why. And if you enjoyed me getting into it in this video, you probably like the nitty-gritty of sport and all its peripheries, so I really think you'd enjoy Beyond the Bleachers. It's this really well-produced 3-part series about stadiums in both North America and Europe, how they differ, how they're shaped by the traditions of their fans, and how they fit into their cities, and it's great. Now, I really enjoyed it as a British person growing up with our style of sports grounds and being able to understand more about the American style, often bigger and maybe a little bit more disconnected. But I know a lot of you are from North America, so I'm sure you'd get a kick out of seeing things the other way, into Europe and our different histories with stadiums in our cities. Beyond the Bleachers is a Nebula exclusive series, and I honestly cannot recommend Nebula enough. It's a platform for creators like me who just really want to share with you what they find interesting, funny, and curious. And on top of all the ad-free early access content, Nebula are producing increasing numbers of prestige exclusive original content that you cannot find anywhere else. It's genuinely cool stuff with over 200 creators across the platform. I've always been a fan of Lindsay Ellis's film analysis essays, and I love the excellent and accessible science explainers of Up and Atom. And if you fancy watching Beyond the Bleachers as well as any other series and shows across the platform, you can get 50% off a Nebula subscription with my link, go.nebula.tv/chainbear, which you can click from the description right now. It's only $2.50 a month or $30 for the entire year. Thank you again for watching this video, and thank you for your patience on the last video as I was going through some teething issues with audio. I ditched those clowns at Adobe, so I'm using like 5 new software applications to do these now. Hopefully this was a smoother experience for you. This was also written and put together before China, so hopefully nothing happens that makes me look like a fool.